welcome to the Fleming Room, which we did not know was named the Fleming Room, so well done for making it here. I imagine it's going to be one of those ones where people are like, finally found it in about 10 minutes. But it's a pleasure to introduce you to this seminar. I'm not going to talk for very long. We heard some great stuff from Mark this morning. And if you want to grab him for a coffee and chat more about nerding out about the arts, I did that this morning. It was great fun. Come in, this is the Fleming Room. Okay, he's not looking for that. Never mind. So I'm just going to pray, and then people can hear from you what you want to say rather than me making it up. Let's pray for Mark. Can I put a hand on you? Is that okay? Yeah. Father God, we thank you so much for Mark, for his passion, for the way that he sees the world, for the gifts that you've given him in creative arts. And Lord, we pray that you will inspire us, that you will open our minds, that we will see Jesus in what he speaks to us today, and that we will go back into our home cities and back onto our home campuses and be able to share the gospel even more vividly because of what he shares today. So, Lord, give us listening ears, let us not be distracted, and let us be inspired and transformed. Amen.
Amen. Transpired, that'd be good, wouldn't it? Yeah. You heard it here first. Yeah. That QR code will take you to a handout. The handout both is an outline of what I'm going to say, but also there's a reading list at the end of a whole bunch of different books. Unfortunately, they're all English language ones. Some of them, I think, have been translated into several languages, but you'll just have to search them out. But I want to start with a kind of apologetic for imagination. Your imagination matters. But Christians are very nervous of the imagination, and maybe that's something you have picked up from your experiences in churches. Maybe it's something you feel yourself. Maybe you're just not quite sure what to do with it or make of it. Some might think that it has little to do with preaching the gospel and proclaiming, because after all, our job is to be faithful to the gospel. We're not changing it. We're not messing around with it. It's a good deposit that's been passed down from generation to generation. What's imagination got to do with anything? Our job is to be faithful stewards. I would suggest that way of thinking is fairly common. It also implies actually a lack of self-awareness and how much one is already using the imagination in the first place. But also, if one is resisting thinking about that and trying to engage with the imagination as we proclaim the gospel, we will find that we might have a particular demographic or group of people to whom we naturally have an affinity, and we can dialogue, we can speak without very much interference, as it were. But we will find ourselves, if, say, for example, you are working in the same campus environment over many years, several years, you will find yourself pretty much out of date very, very quickly, because things will have changed, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, sometimes just different. And basically, we are in danger of being completely outdated and even incomprehensible. Now, what do you make of that? I just sort of throw that out to sort of get the juices going after I know you've been snoozing and just sort of swanning around and sort of lying on the beach or something. We're here to do serious work now. What do you make of that? Okay, so that was a joke. No, it's fine. No, it's good. I'm happy with that.
We're going to have this on so the recording can hear. Yep. So just wave at me.
Thank you. I suppose you naturally relate to your own generation, don't you? So your go-to is communicating to your own generation. So I'm on the cusp of Gen Z, but trying to then understand Gen Z, if I'm not actively engaging my imagination to do that, I suppose I'm agreeing with your point. That if I'm not trying to think through how different generations think, I'm at risk of thinking everyone thinks the same way as I do, and I've only got my millennial lenses on. And even I say millennial, then with all of the different constructs and presuppositions that I come with.
So I imagine that in these sorts of circles, you are talking about the generations quite a lot and analysing some of the differences. But let me just sort of push back a little bit. What's the imagination got to do with it? Why are we even thinking in those terms? Don't we just have to understand this group of people? Why bother with the imagination? Yep. Oh, no, she's closer to the mic.
I was going to say similar off the back of what you just said, Duncan, about I wonder if imagination allows us to transcend generation and sometimes culture in terms of nationality type culture by using creative arts type culture. Does that make sense? And so I think, because we can read some literature from a few hundred years ago and it can engage with us now. They're not Gen Z. And so that's something you've left me thinking.
Gen G or something.
Yeah. Like to not think about engaging culture, meaning engaging today's students, but meaning engaging with the arts in order to reach every generation. Does that make sense?
That's great. Because, and it is a phenomenon that artistic creations in all kinds of different forms actually do not seem chained to their historical moment. I was just reading something, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein just been made into another movie. What an amazing book. She was only 19 or whatever. That has had an extraordinary impact, that book, in all kinds of different fields. And yet if you know anything about that period when she was writing it, it is so of its time, and yet it somehow transcends. I think that's a good word. It somehow leaps over different generations and can speak. So that's a really interesting phenomenon by itself. But I think that hints at one of the things that we're trying to do here is to say, well, actually, what other people have produced through their imaginations and the work we try to do in terms of relating to other people as an act of the imagination mean that this is really quite significant and important for any ministry. Do you want to? Okay, that's allowed. We've got lots of consensus in this room. It's just great. We're allowed to disagree as well. I will beat you up otherwise. That's a joke. Yeah, we'll keep coming back to this thing. But I think one of the problems that we have is we are suspicious and nervous about the imagination. Maybe I was actually told by a teacher when I was about 8, and my mother is a painter, she's an artist, and she's just turned 80, she's still painting, she has a little shed in the garden, and she's still churning stuff out. So she's been an inspiration all my life, but this teacher, when I was like 7 or 8, was actually talking to mum and dad at a parent-teacher evening, and he said that I didn't have an imagination. My mum was absolutely incensed. Now, basically, I didn't relate to this guy, and I never really said anything in his classes. So I suppose, there wasn't a lot of evidence. But what a really dumb thing to say about anybody. Because actually, I would say you cannot live without your imagination. You are using your imagination in all kinds of different ways every day. You might not call it that, but you are thinking, you are trying to figure out how to plan your day. That is an act of the imagination. When you are going to the supermarket and thinking, okay, so we're going to have these people around for a meal, what do I need to... that is your imagination. You are projecting into the future. Otherwise, you're kind of restricted to a sort of eternal present. But not only that, actually, I think particularly in this part of the world, because of the impact of the Enlightenment, or rather enlightenments, because there were several, there are lots of different aspects to it. It's not just one kind of monolithic thing. In different parts of the continent, there were different aspects and different sort of focuses. But I think this in large part is one of the reasons why we are nervous about talking about the imagination, and this has sort of spilled over into churches. So let me just show you a sort of simple diagram, what I've rather pompously called the epistemological divide. Don't worry about it. It just means, how do we know what we know, and what do we know when we know it? And do we know it, or do we not? That kind of thing. So it's very straightforward. Everyone with me so far? So basically, in terms of trying to figure out what is true, what is the truth, what is true truth, where do we go? Well, the Enlightenment will have tended to side with what I've called the left-hand side of the realm of facts. These are things that are true. You know, in the same circumstances, altitude and pressure and stuff, water 100 degrees centigrade, that's when it boils. And you know that, you can predict it, doesn't matter where you are in the world. If the circumstances are the same, it'll happen. So, the realm of scientific data and statement. We're talking about the physical realm, things where actually you can measure and you can say this is objectively true, and we can have degrees of certainty about this, not saying absolute certainty, but degrees of certainty that mean that this can then be discussed publicly because we have a shared frame of reference. We can talk about these things, and we've got a starting point. And we're looking at the realm of phenomena. Things that, so it comes from a classical Greek word. Phenomena is things that have appeared, so they are, in quotes, real, they're actual, they can therefore be measured, like air pressure or speed, or all these different things. And because all of these things sort of, people have studied different aspects of them at great length, the result of these inquiries and scientific investigations then applied to technology mean that in the modern world, we can do all kinds of things, like sit in an airplane with 300 other people and end up several hours later on the other side of the planet, which 100 years ago was inconceivable, or was beginning to be conceivable. But that is because of the success of all of this side of stuff. These things we can say are true. And that's all very helpful. So the case for this side of the divide being one of objective truth is a very strong case. And it means that we could go around the world. A friend of mine, actually, she's an artist, and she was the official cartoonist and sketch artist for a big conference in Beijing on kidneys. So that was cool. And I didn't know that these sort of conferences had those sort of people. She's a very talented, not a scientist at all, but she really had to learn all about kidneys so that she could draw. And basically her job was to do cartoons all through the conference to help people grasp the topics on the stage. So that was all very exciting. But, the fact that there is a conference of doctors gathered from all over the planet talking about kidneys assumes all kinds of things in common about the physical, biological, corporal world. Now, none of that is a surprise. We know this. This is the way things are. The problem is, if we think truth is only this, we get into problems, because actually there's a whole realm that this doesn't even come close to touching. And this is the realm of meaning. That's a dumb thing. I put the... Okay, well, this will be a fun game. What have I covered up? Yeah, so, okay. So we're in the realm of the religious. Well, immediately we're told that's not public square. We can't really talk about that in public. Keep that to yourself. Because we don't have an agreed frame of reference. Keep God off campuses. Let's have that. It was very striking, wasn't it, this morning, that installation of the sort of submerged church in the middle of the campus. I mean, not exactly subtle, and actually not exactly right either, but that's a whole other thing, and he touched on that, didn't we? The metaphysical, in other words, not the physical, the metaphysical, if you like, the beyond physical. So metaphysics is actually the kind of things that are not within the scientific realm, the physical realm on earth, but they are the things beyond. Is there anything beyond? Now, many secular people, and it's debatable how many there are left who are true scientific materialists. There are probably not that many around, actually, but some people have a pose of doing that, don't they? But they would then, if they were consistent, they would rule out the possibility of metaphysics altogether. It just doesn't exist. It's not a category that relates to anything. So the beyond is just not a thing, which is why they will say, theology is just the study of fairy tales and unicorns, and it's a waste of time. And so, you can trust, you can have faith in that if you like, and I really admire your faith, but I don't want it, just as I don't want your cold. I don't want to catch that. I'm going to keep away. It's just a matter of opinion. Just keep it to yourself. It's subject. Subjective. It's basically, that's your view. And we can agree to disagree, or we can agree just to sort of share our views and have a lovely time and eat ice creams or something. It's private. And then this relates to the sort of metaphysical. That word is actually noumenal, Noumenal. It's the opposite of phenomenal. The noumen, it's the sort of the spiritual. And it's interesting, isn't it? That's coming back these days. People say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. It's the sense that there is something beyond. There is something metaphysical. Now, why bang on about this? Well, the thing is, those in the sort of scientific materialist view, the sort of hard and fast Enlightenment thinkers, reject this as having any significance or value at all. It's nice if it keeps you going and stops you getting depressed. And that's lovely for you. That's not how I am. I just believe in facts, just the facts. But basically, this is not for public debate. You can't really talk about these things in the same way that you can't really have a public debate about your dreams because no one else had them. But the interesting thing is that, and I think you're seeing this, that actually things are sort of moving around and shifting. And this relates to some of the sort of political things that are going on, and it's complex, but the sense that actually we don't really trust the experts anymore, and scientists do funny things, and some of their data is a bit fraudulent. Maybe you can't really trust what they're doing with it, and particularly when you come to the soft sciences, well, then it's really dodgy, and they've just sort of all made it all up and blah, blah, blah. So basically, let's just move out of this stuff and just let's have a lovely spiritual time in our own little bubbles. And if you'd like to join me, feel free. Otherwise, go and do your bubble thing. And definitely, there's become a kind of doubt and suspicion about this whole endeavor, and just focusing on, well, what is effectively the relativist world of just me, my thoughts, and my spiritual journey and that kind of thing. And, I cannot tell you what to do in the same way you cannot tell me what to do, and so on. Now, I say all that because actually, I think it's the case in Scripture, and it's certainly the case in many Christian thinkers in the last 2,000 years at different points for various different reasons. They have understood that actually both of these are important, and that we need to find a way to see how they're connected, that you can't have one without the other. And it's a question of understanding their spheres, if you like, to what extent, or what is the realm being claimed here? What is actually the realm of facts? Is that all that there is, or is there something else? And one of the key people to really wrestle with this was somebody who found this problem a deeply and profoundly personal one. We've already had him once today. We're going to have him again now. It's Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis. So there he is, looking very jovial indeed with his cigarette, as he always was. Now, he gets brought up a house full of grief. He and his older brother, Warnie, their mother died when they were young. And their father basically kind of locked down in grief and was really unable to manage with two teenage boys and look after them because he couldn't really cope with life himself anyway. So the whole thing, there were these three people living in this house in Belfast who had just broken. And the two boys would just basically escape to the attic and they tell stories. They make up stories about, worlds with talking animals and all kinds of strange and wonderful things happening. So I don't know if that sounds familiar or like anything else. I'll leave that with you. But this was very precious to them, and it's actually how they sort of got through it. But then, in order to get them ready for, C.S. Lewis, Jack as he was known, ready for the horrible boarding school in England that he was sent to live with this tutor in the south of England called The Knock. That was his nickname. And The Knock was a very hard and strong scientific materialist. He was one of these people on the left-hand side who said, basically, what you see is all that you get. There's nothing beyond. And he was utterly rigorous and consistent. He would question every word Lewis used, this young teenager. So why do you use that word? Is that what you mean? Say what you mean what you say, all this sort of stuff. Now, of course, this would have a profound benefit in the years to come when he became a writer because, and it's one of the reasons his writing is so great, is that he really knows how to express exactly what he wants to express. That's a gift that very few people have. But he came out of this absolutely convinced as an atheist. By the time he goes to university, he's been in the First World War. He's invalided out of the First World War. And then he goes back to Oxford. And he is basically a convinced atheist who finds himself hanging out with one or two people who are not. And they help him to see that it's not a question, it's not a kind of zero-sum game. You don't have to give up the right-hand column to hold on to the left-hand column. In fact, you need both of them. So one of the things that he will say as he grows up is that reason is the natural organ of truth. That's how you figure out truth. You need your reason, but imagination is the organ of meaning. That's how you work out the significance of things. The facts cannot tell you that. You need something else to help you figure out, well, why is this important? How do you make a distinction between lots and lots of data and what is important data? How do you weed it out? Now, he was really haunted by this problem. And he actually says in his famous book, which is his sort of testimony, Surprised by Joy. Has anyone read Surprised by Joy? So there's this wonderful bit where he's explaining the dilemma that he faced. Because he said, nearly everything that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. And by imaginary, that meant worthless. It's not significant. It doesn't matter. It's just fantasy. And even, I don't know in your languages, but even in English, those words give it a sense of just not that, it's not weighty, it's not that important. So nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Do you see the problem? Now, I certainly wouldn't have, been able to articulate that, nor sort of see it as clearly as a teenager, let alone as an undergraduate. Few people are able to put it that sort of starkly and bluntly, but he's absolutely right. And this was what was an agony to him, because basically he would become basically an English literature professor, specializing in early Middle Ages and Renaissance literature. Late Middle Ages and Renaissance literature. So basically as distant and separated from the scientific materialist world of facts you could not find. It's basically a very different realm. So that's what his passion is, but everything in his education is telling it that's worthless. And yet in his heart, he knows it's not. He knows that there's truth there, there's significance, there's meaning, there's a sense of belonging. He could relate to this stuff, even though it was written 400, 500, 600 years before. And he couldn't bring them together until, well, it was Tolkien and some of the other friends in their what became the Inklings who helped him to recognize that actually myth has significance and weight, because it is possible for myth, and I think people often assume the word myth is the same as meaning false, don't they? They think if it's myth, then it didn't happen. Whereas Tolkien convinced Lewis that actually the Christian gospel about Jesus it has so many of the features of myth, but it's the true myth. It happened. And actually, if there is a God who is at work and has given order to the universe and our world and our lives, then it would make sense if actually the yearnings that we might have that get expressed in literature or in the arts or in music or whatever find their fulfillment in Christ when he comes to earth. It actually makes sense that that's what would happen, as indeed I believe it did. But another person who was really significant for Lewis, coming to see these two parts of himself combined, was the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was a good mate of William Wordsworth. Don't worry if you haven't ever heard of these people. If romantic English, yes, hi. He wrote The Ancient Mariner. That's right, exactly. Now, he and William Wordsworth were from the sort of the end of the 18th century. Wordsworth actually was present in the weeks after the French Revolution in Paris. He actually went to see what was going on, and they were fascinated by this and very excited by it. Obviously, like everybody, completely unaware of what was going to happen in the Terror, which happened just within 2 or 3 years of that first sort of spark, if you like. So they were quite radical as young men, and they could see what was happening to rural England particularly. So they were both English. They could see how this new thing called industry, and it's right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, was absolutely destroying land and lives. And, you know, some of the factories in places like Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds and stuff, they were utterly dehumanizing as well as profoundly toxic and just eating up the land, wreaking environmental havoc. And this was heartbreaking. And they could see how basically it was just removing people from a sense of the world as it should be or could be, and a spiritual world. They were looking for something spiritual. And so they went to some of the more sort of wild, remote parts of the country in England, and they spent some time down in Devon and the southwest, and then famously they ended up in the Lake District, just south of the Scottish border in northwest England. And Wordsworth actually spent the rest of his life living up there. And basically they were sort of in love with the natural world, almost to the point of worshipping it, almost. They were sort of groping around, trying to figure out what is remarkable, and you never hear this in English literature faculties really, is that by the end of their lives, both men had come to a very clear recognition and trust in the Trinitarian God of the Scriptures. You don't often hear that. But in some ways, you mentioned The Ancient Mariner, this big epic poem. By the weird thing about that poem is that it seems to anticipate what will happen to Coleridge himself. Because the conclusion of the poem seems to basically get yourself sorted with God. That's the only way to deal with this stuff. That's to cut a very long story short. Anyway, he just couldn't stop writing. Words just poured out of Coleridge. And in one essay, he explained why he was a poet. Now, it's quite sort of oldie-worldy, fancy English, so I'll explain it, because I know that even modern English speakers struggle with this. Let me pick out some key things here. So what is he trying to do? As he sits down at his desk to write a poem, what does he hope for will happen? Well, he wants to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural. In other words, he's not saying you're going to meet God through my poem, but it's going to feel a bit like that. Analogous means sort of like that. Analogous to the supernatural. You think, but this is just a poem. What are you talking about? How's he going to do that? Well, he's going to awaken the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom. I love that phrase, but it sounds completely impossible to understand, I guess, for many. Let me explain. The lethargy of custom. Lethargy is about being sleepy, or actually in ancient Greek, it might even mean death. The Lethe was one of the rivers in the underworld. And so if you are embarking on the river Lethe, then that's a really bad sign, just so you know. Be warned. But normally in everyday life, it's basically being sleepy. And the lethargy of custom is that experience of walking down the same street every day for years, and you know exactly where you're going. You could do it with your eyes closed, and maybe you actually literally do have your eyes closed, and it means you don't notice stuff. And he's saying, actually, because you think you've seen it all, you don't look anymore, and so I'm going to write poems to make you see again. In fact, to see the things that you thought you knew. And directing the mind, that is, to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. So you might walk down the same street every day, going to the bus or to the train or going to work or whatever it is, and basically you never look at the fact that between the paving stones, little green shoots are coming up. And maybe you think, oh, it's just weeds. But actually, isn't that amazing? Solid concrete, and nature finds a way to break. And maybe he writes a poem about a weed or a little flower that, you know, you've seen millions of flowers in your life. How often have you just stopped to look at one and just think about the fact of that life that came from a seed that was accidentally thrown in that place, maybe dropped from a bird's beak or something? Who knows? And he says, this is lovely. There are wonders in the world, but because you're walking with your eyes half closed, you just don't notice. I want you to see, because it is an inexhaustible treasure. It's a treasure, but we don't notice it. But for which, in consequence of, and these unpacks the first one, and then there's a second added one. He says, the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude. So film of familiarity. That's another way of saying lethargy of custom. What does that mean? He does not mean movies or cinemas, because of course they hadn't been invented. Film is like, or it's like, you know, that if you've ever seen those nature documentaries of pond life and those insects that skate along the top of the water, you know, water boatmen and these little things, you know, and there's a sort of film on the surface of the water that they can walk on. That's the kind of film he'd be talking about. But more specifically, I think it's the kind of film that's like a cataract. My dog is very stupid and now has cataracts to make it much worse. So she walked into doors and things. You know, I'm not going to spend money dealing with that. She's just going to have to deal with it. don't write into your member of parliament or anything like that. It's just the way it is. Anyway, harsh but fair. But anyway, The Cataract basically is this film that covers over the eyes, and maybe it doesn't quite make you completely blind. Maybe you see shadows and dark and light and stuff, but you don't see. And it's a film of familiarity because you've seen it so many times, you've stopped seeing it altogether. But sometimes I don't want to see. Sometimes it's not in my interest to see. So I'm a Londoner. I was born in London. It's my sort of center of gravity, really. I love going back to London. We live just outside it now. But I find it a deep, deep shame that one of the wealthiest cities in the world has one of the largest homelessness problems. But I know what it's like. You'll be walking down a street and you'll clock up ahead. There are a couple of people begging for money. They're homeless, perhaps. And I'm thinking, I've got to get to that Bible study. I don't have time to stop. And actually, I've got no change. And so what do? Well, you clock them, and then you make sure you're looking over there. That's interesting. Yes, I'd never, because you don't want to see. That is selfish solicitude. It's not, I'm just not going to go there. And Coleridge says he's writing poetry to shake you by the lapels and say, no, look at this. Sometimes it's very arresting. Sometimes he is alarming. And in fact, the Ancient Mariner, again, basically there's a wedding guest who makes the fatal error of asking this old bloke a question. And he has to sit through a huge epic poem that goes on for pages and pages and pages. He's never going to do that again. But basically, that's kind of what the mariner is doing. He's warning this guy who's just at a wedding not to make the mistakes he made. That is what Coleridge is saying is the point of poetry. And look how he goes on. He says, we have eyes, yet see not. Ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Now, does that sound a little bit familiar? Now, he's not a Christian at this point, as far as I know, but the Bible was so much part of the culture that he would, people were educated in it, they would have known it, and he would say, effectively, he's trying to do what Jesus said he was trying to do by writing a poem, which is so interesting. So, you can sum it up. What is his point? Well, he wants to help us see what our overfamiliarity hides and what our selfishness avoids. What other professions do you think could take this as a kind of manifesto? Preacher, right. Isn't that what we're doing? I've been training preachers for years. Isn't that what we're doing with the Bible? I mean, isn't it amazing? You can read, the parable of the Good Samaritan 1,000 times, and then on the 1,001st, you've actually looked properly. And you see something that you hadn't seen or you didn't want to see. Anybody else? Other jobs? Artists? Right. So a painter's doing that very clearly. Yeah? Right. Go on. Right. They're out there in the street protesting, saying, look, and we don't want to look. Yeah? Good historians. Doctors, exactly. Maybe you've got some mystery illness, and several people have just not taken some different symptoms seriously. That somebody has looked again and said, okay, this might be connected to that. Isn't it interesting? You remember back in the horrible days of COVID? We forget there was nothing guaranteed about the fact that the vaccines were suddenly going to appear. And in the end, what was it? There were sort of 5 or 6 that sort of did the round. Some were better than others. But actually, at the beginning, nobody knew how long it was going to take. And it wasn't guaranteed that they would be able to do it. Who knows how many more people would have died of it? But basically, what happened was that people were, by the urgency and the sort of global nature of the crisis, they were forced, and these were people who had been investigating coronaviruses for decades. They go back and look again and say, what actually is going on? What are we missing? What are we not seeing? And interrogating the data again, and then having bright ideas and suddenly thinking, hey, what happens if we do this and that? Now, don't ask me to explain what this or that is, because I don't do science. I leave that to other people. But in a sense, that you've got creative people in laboratories who are looking again and then using their imagination to think, okay, how do we approach this differently? Actually, I would say this is pretty much any profession. Okay, what do these folk who help us then, these artists? I said this morning that they see stuff and they communicate what they see. What actually happens? What is the benefit of listening to what they have to say, even if they don't say it in words? So I've mentioned Picasso. Sometimes artists, because of what they see, are like the canaries in the mine. In the old mines, they would take canaries because they were sensitive to gas that was not able to be smelled. It was basically invisible and you couldn't sense it. But basically, if these little birds died in their cage, then you knew there was a problem and people got out. It was the only way of telling. Sometimes artists are like the canaries in the mine in a society. They don't know what it is. The canaries don't know what the gas is. They don't know why they've just dropped dead because, well, obviously they're dead. So, They can't articulate what is wrong. They don't know the significance necessarily of what they are seeing, but they communicate it. So a fascinating example comes from Picasso. A friend of his, this guy, Lucien Clergue, who was a photographer in the south of France, lived quite near the Picassos. And he and his wife went to the Picassos for lunch one day. And they were just sort of having a glass of wine before the meal or whatever, and suddenly Picasso just turned to Lucien and said, go to a hospital. He's like, what? You've only just got here. No, you must go. And Picasso's wife at the time said, no, if Pablo says that, you must go. He's a prophet. And you think, what? And but he did. He went to the hospital. And as soon as he arrived in the hospital, he was wheeled into the operating theatre almost immediately. He had a rare form of peritonitis that kills without presenting any pain. Picasso saved his life. Picasso did not have any medical training. He wouldn't have known at all what was going on, but he could see that something was wrong. Because basically, Picasso painted thousands of portraits. He looked into faces all the time. But he could sense in this guy that there was a problem. And he said, go to somebody who can work this out. I don't know what this is, but go. He did, and it was absolutely right. He saved his life. Now, that's a very extreme example, but I think that's quite a good metaphor for what's going on sometimes in the arts. David Hockney is a British artist who was talking about this moment. Someone was telling him this anecdote about Clergue, and Hockney's comment was, he said he wasn't surprised, suggesting that Picasso likely saw something in his friend's face. He must have looked at more faces than almost anybody. Most people don't look at a face too long. They tend to look away. But if you're painting a portrait, that's exactly what you do. I mean, if I start looking at you in your face all the time, and I don't move my gaze to think about other people in the room, you are beginning, I hope, to feel quite uncomfortable. Or you're quite chilled about this. You're happy? Okay.
I'm used to it.
Oh, right. Is that because you're the center of attention? But if you are sitting for a portrait, it's one of the very few times in life where you will allow somebody to completely stare at your face. It's a very odd thing, actually. And if somebody does it, like on the metro or something, that's creepy and they should probably go to jail. But Picasso's allowed to do it because he's an artist and he's painting this person's portrait. But he's looking and seeing. Sensitivity to church abuses. I just touched on this because even just this weekend, I've already been talking to one or two people about situations where people have been treated really badly in churches. I was at a conference in the States a few years ago, and the main speaker was Andy Crouch. I don't know if you've come across him. He's written quite a number of culture making, The Weak and the Strong, a number of books. Fascinating guy. He was an IFES worker in the US, InterVarsity, for many years. What I hadn't realized before this conference is that he trained as a musician. He was at a music college in Philadelphia, and he trained as a pianist. And so he did his lecture jumping up and down from the piano. It was fantastic. He was very, very good. It was around the time that some of these big name abuses were coming out. And so inevitably people are talking about them. I don't need to name them. I'm sure you're well aware of some of these stories. But Andy Crouch made a fascinating point. He was just talking about the arts generally, but as a sort of sideline, he made a fascinating point. He said a number of those big names Andy had met at various points in conferences, and you know how it is. And there are some people he'd always had a sort of icky feeling a bit about, but nothing sinful, nothing you could sort of pinpoint. But and he didn't think much of it. But he knew some of the people who'd been to churches led by some of these people, and as these stories came out, he'd noticed a little sort of trend in a number of places. He said, in a number of these churches led by abusive leaders, not always, but very often, the first people to leave are the arty ones. Because they're somehow sensitive to the world around them, sometimes because they're just difficult. I mean, arty people can be very difficult. So I'm not saying that if artists leave your church, it means alarm bells should be ringing. But they were able to sense that something didn't smell quite right. And they wouldn't perhaps never have worked out exactly what it was, but they just knew that they shouldn't be there, and they started leaving. And I think that fits with precisely this phenomenon, because basically they are used to seeing and engaging with the world around them in whatever way. So it's one reason, actually, in churches why we should take our artists very seriously and listen to them. But that's a whole other thing. I don't know if anybody wants to come back at that or ask any questions at this stage. We're about halfway through. Yeah, over. It's not.
I thought I might be creative. So.
Okay, try.
Do you compare the artists with the canaries because they also get famous after they die?
Just say that again.
At least one laugh. Very good. Yeah, that was it.
You had something you actually wanted to say.
Okay, cool. That was great.
Do you think the thing about artists being first to leave, is that correlating with churches and church leaders that are from a particular cross-section of the church, which are often more likely to be facts-driven rather than the meaning side-driven? Does that make sense?
Yes. Maybe. So the question is is this because some of these churches tend to be more on the left side of the valley than the other, and so they don't really value things that are more imaginative, creative, and so on? There may be something in that. I'm always very nervous of drawing a direct line from a theological position and things that go wrong. Because the reality is, every theology is going to have things that it may lead to, but that doesn't necessarily mean it does. People are always looking for patterns and conspiracies and stuff and say, oh, well, it's just this type of preacher or this type of theology or whatever. And actually, the longer you go on, the more you realize it doesn't work like that. And actually, these things are because people are sinful, not just certain theological positions. But there is something in, I have got to know lots of people who are sort of more arty, and they do find church much harder than many, simply because it is not generally engaging with the things that make life rich for them. And their opinions are not really valued because it's on the wrong side of the valley. And I think that is absolutely tragic and disastrous. And one of the things that Andy Crouch did in his talk, he said, I've got two main points. One you will love. Is a big room of about 400 people are involved in the arts in all kinds of ways. He says, the first point you're going to love, the second point you're going to hate. The first point you're going to love. Church needs artists. Second point, artists need the church. We're not better or lone rangers and so on. And actually, it's something that's a lesson that needs to be repeated often in those sorts of circles a lot. But I hear what you're saying, and it does seem, unfortunately, to be a bit of a trend that some of the more conservative, perhaps, churches are uncomfortable because actually one reason, I think, is that the arts you can't really control. And in fact, the whole point is that you're putting it out there and it's gone. You cannot determine how it'll impact people. You cannot decide in advance what message will come across. You can say, well, I'd like to be able to communicate this or that, but you cannot predetermine. But here's the thing. I don't think you can really do that with a sermon either. And that's where the problem is, not with the arts, but that's a whole other thing. Do you want to?
I'd like to ask a bit about the concept of death of the author, and sort of this idea of if imaginatives are sort of the meaning makers of the world around us, who is it that does the interpreting? So in a lot of sort of literature, there are a lot of discussions about people who do see the world in a different way, who see beyond. But then as people hear what they've interpreted, what they've written about, they've decided that it's the audience who interpret the meaning. And I guess I'm curious about discerning interpretations that have been made. How can we discern whether an interpretation is one that is like, I don't know, I don't want to say based in reality, because I guess that's what imagination is trying to push through. Do you know what I'm trying to get
I
at?
do, exactly, yeah. Let me see if this helps. I think it's one of those, it's the classic sort of pendulum swing. And I'm always sort of nervous to say, well, it's not this extreme, that extreme, it's somewhere in the middle. Well, no, that doesn't necessarily follow. But texts do have meanings, and they do communicate things. One of the sort of philosophers who was an atheist, who talked a lot about this more than perhaps any other, was Umberto Eco. He wrote things like Foucault's Pendulum and The Name of the Rose. I think he's amazing. I don't understand half of what he's talking about. He came to Oxford when I was a student, and not even the professors understood what he was on about, but it was amazing. By the way, there's an amazing video on YouTube of him walking through his personal library. Just search Umberto Eco personal library. It'll blow your tiny minds. But he would say it is an illegitimate interpretation of the Good Samaritan parable to say that this legitimizes child abuse. In other words, there are some interpretations you can rule out as wrong. That doesn't mean you can pinpoint it just necessarily to one thing, but you're going to have a range. And the writer does have a purpose in writing. The writer, she might keep that very hidden, or it might be much more explicit on the page, and different writers take different choices with that kind of thing. But there are meanings there, and we can talk about them. It's not a complete free-for-all, because the people who propose this idea that it is just about whatever your reading is, the death of the author and all that, they still write books. They expect to be understood, so that if you write a review and intentionally misinterpret what they've said, they will be cross with you, because it's not, infinite. And I think the thing is, while we can't say exactly what the author meant, you can make a pretty good stab, and you can say, right, there's a range of meanings here, but it definitely does not mean that. Do you see what I mean? I think but the problem is it's a whole seminar by itself, and we could probably chat about it. I don't necessarily want to go down too far, but you can have a last word.
I guess just like if the concept of imagination is like pushing boundaries into what we see around us, then isn't the natural conclusion in some ways that you could just go so far down the route of being meta that you can even examine literature as a whole and start asking questions about why is this even here? What is storytelling all about? And then sort of dissemble that in some ways until there's no meaning about anything at all.
Well, and there would certainly be people who have an interest in doing that. There's an amazing quote from Aldous Huxley. I'll have to look it up, but it's something like, so he was part of quite a sort of radical set in the first half of the 20th century, ended up living in California. He wrote a book, Chrome Yellow, about, was it LSD he tried? And, very sort of bohemian, sort of kicking off all the constraints and stuff. But he was very honest in his analysis of this, and he said, it is our preference to find the world without meaning. That's not exactly it, but that's the gist of what he's saying. We had a preference for the world to have no meaning, and so therefore we said the world had no meaning. It suited us, and he goes on explicitly to say, for political, sexual revolution and liberation. So they decided, well, we don't like these constraints, so we're just going to cast them off and say, right, no, well, there isn't any meaning. But there's a kind of knowingness to that. But I think we probably need to chat directly, because it's probably not everybody's thing. But it is interesting you picked that up, because I want to talk about my favorite novelist, Graham Greene. Has anyone read any Graham Greene? Awesome guy. Mixed up, messed up guy, but a better novelist for all of that. Probably his finest, certainly one of his finest novels is The Power and the Glory. And it's set in Mexico. He wrote it in 1940. He'd become a Catholic as a young man in his 20s. So that was quite an unusual thing. There were a number of people in English literary circles who all became Catholic around the same time. It was fascinating. He was sent in the 30s by the Catholic Church as a journalist to report on what was happening in Mexico, because there was a communist revolution going on in Mexico, and some of the provinces, the states in Mexico, had actually gone full communist. And there was one state, I can't remember its name, that was particularly virulent, and they were hunting down all the priests and anybody who worked for the church and killing them. So Greene writes a book about that. It's called These Lawless Roads, which is a sort of journalistic account of his time in Mexico. But he was so affected by what he witnessed, he wrote a novel about it as well called The Power and the Glory. And this is about a main character who we never know his name. He's just known as the whiskey priest. He's a very bad priest. He's an alcoholic. And he thinks more about booze than anything else. He's desperate for the next drink. He also has a child in a village, so that's obviously not ideal if you're a Catholic priest as well. So there are all kinds of ways in which he's not a very good model, but he's the last one left in this state. And the chief of police, the colonel in charge of the hunt for Catholic priests, is basically, this is the last one, and he's going to get him. There's an amazing bit where about halfway through the novel, it's a kind of, sort of dramatic irony where we, the reader, know what's going on, but the characters in the story don't know what's going on. This colonel happens to have just dropped in on a small local police station. The police captain there is a friend, and they like drinking and playing cards. So the colonel, who is after the whiskey priest, is actually in the police station. And the whiskey priest, who's obviously just wearing civilian clothes, he doesn't look anything like a priest or whatever, he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, and he's thrown in the communal cell where there are about 20 people. He's got a false name, obviously. He's on the run, the colonel is just next door playing cards. So that's a sort of frisson. That is a moment of tension in there. But all these people are thrown in this cell. It's dark. But there is one woman who is a pious Catholic, and she recognizes him. And she wants him to rebuke a couple who are making love in the corner of the cell. And she's utterly appalled by this behavior. Serious PDA, public displays of affection, is not good, not on. And she's expecting the priest to rebuke them. And he can't. He won't. He just doesn't think that's appropriate in that situation, apart from anything else, quite apart from the fact that actually it might expose him even further. And Green describes this woman as very pious, but she discovers that he is a bad priest who craves a drink more than anything, even more than God, Green says. Now, the priest attempts to show her kindness, to which she responds to him, "The sooner you are dead, the better." Well, that's a strange kind of piety. And he's absolutely floored by this, devastated by it. And he's sitting there in the darkness, pondering his own soul and the spite within this woman. Why is she treating me like this? And Green describes his thought processes, and it's one of my favorite passages in all fiction. And it's about the necessity of empathy. So there he is, feeling like a worm in this prison cell. He says, when you visualize a man or woman carefully, you could always begin to feel pity. There was a quality God's image carried with it. When you saw the lines at the corners of the eyes, the shape of the mouth, how the hair grew, it was impossible to hate. Hate was just a failure of imagination. Now, like many prophetic artist, Graham Greene reminds us that to love, we must first be able to imagine the lives of others, to imagine what it's like to be in their shoes, and to recognize the image of God in them. So the book goes on. He thought, poor woman, she's had nothing at all. If only one could find the right word. He leant hopelessly back, moving carefully so as not to waken the old man who's next to him. But the right words never came to him. He was more out of touch with her kind than he'd ever been. He would have known what to say to her in the old days, feeling no pity at all then, speaking with half a mind, a platitude or two. But now he felt useless. He was a criminal and ought only to talk to criminals. He'd done wrong again, trying to break down her complacency. He might just as well have her let her go on thinking him a martyr. Now, it's very involved, and we sort of see into his mind and his thought processes. But I find that astonishing. He's trying to figure out, because he knows it's his duty as a priest, as a Christian, to love this woman who's been utterly foul to him and threatens his life. But isn't that an extraordinary sentence? It was impossible to hate because hate is just a failure of the imagination. Putting yourself in others' shoes. Here's a sculptor. Some of you have seen me use his stuff before. Bruno Catalano. I think he was born in Tunisia to Italian parents. He now lives in France. But throughout his 20s and 30s, he worked in merchant shipping. He worked on huge tankers and what are those? The trade things that in the come on, help me out here. What are those things that trade gets put in? Big box, not the box, Containers, that's the one. Hallelujah. Thank you very much. You can come again. So these container ships and all that. I mean, it wasn't an important point. It was just annoying me. He is now a sculptor, having, spent his life on the seas, been to every port on the planet pretty much. Now, he knows what it's like to be a foreigner in a strange land where you don't speak the language. He's created a series of sculptures called Les Voyageurs, the travelers in French. And they are placed, usually this series anyway, on dock sides in port cities. And he lives near Marseille, and so this is some of the installations in the docks at Marseille. What do you make of those? Right. So there's stuff missing. Yep. Anything else? Okay, I'm sure there's something in that. And actually, literally, they look straight through them. I mean, that's an idiom in English. It may not translate to your heart languages, but in English, there is the idiom, I look straight through him. In other words, not literally, but it's like, it was as if they didn't exist. What else is going on? That's definitely one of the things. Right. And some of the things they leave behind are really quite vital. I mean, quite a lot of organs missing. Right. Yeah. So this one doesn't even get ahead. Yeah. So this is Venice, actually, this one. You can just tell on the side of the Grand Canal there. But yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yep. Yep. Yeah, but there's not a lot of it. They've got a bit of luggage. Maybe this is the only bit of luggage they have. Baggage. In this one, definitely. And that one too, yes. No, you're right, in all of them. That's exactly right. Yes. Right. Right. So the boats crossing the Mediterranean and then crossing the English Channel and stuff. There's a lot of rhetoric around in many of our countries, isn't there, about people traveling to our countries. And some of it is really terrifying rhetoric and language and descriptions of people that seems to imply they're no better than animals. And clearly not having, well, they're covering up if they have, they've not really thought what it must be like, what sort of thing might drive a young mother with a baby of 6 months to get onto a rubber dinghy with 30 other people in the English Channel? Why would you do that? Unless you are absolutely desperate. You don't do that just for a day out. What I think is so remarkable, I mean, you know, as a kind of sort of engineering exercise, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's clearly made of metal. You can do this in metal in a way that you probably couldn't with wood and other materials. And you know, it's disturbing. You look at it and you sort of catch it maybe, you know, half an eye, and it forces you, hey, hang on, what's going on there? So just the technique of it is forcing you to look a bit more closely and say, oh, how does that work? What's going on? And it draws you in a brilliant way. And it's forcing you just to think about what actually is somebody sacrificing to arrive with this one bag, say. What have they left behind? Everybody's got a story. And I think just like Graham Greene and the Whiskey Priest, using his imagination to try and figure out what got this woman to be so angry and bitter and cruel. So Catalano is someone who has traveled the world and known what it's like to be an alien, if you like. He's saying, look, these are people. And I don't know about you, but for me, I look at those and it's arresting. It's forcing me to just ask simple questions, to have some empathy. Do you see what I mean? Isn't this the kind of thing that Coleridge was talking about? Selfish solicitude. Oh, I'd rather not think about what it's like to drive. You know, why are people getting into small boats to cross from Turkey to Greece? I don't really want to have to think about that. That's selfish solicitude. Truth, beauty, and justice. And very often, art at its best is a combination of all three, or at least two of them. I've just now got a few sort of quick examples that we could talk about, or I don't know, we've got 15 minutes before we finish. Would you rather have some questions now, or jokes? Or should I give you one or two more, or what would you like to do? More? More. Feed me. Okay. Okay.
For the recording, please.
At first, I thought the seminar would be about different cultures and how the gospel would relate to that. So it's not that.
It's not.
I'm loving
okay.
it. I'm loving it.
Okay, cool.
What is the point you want to bring across? Is it like you should do something with cultural stuff, art, I don't know, the right side? You have to use it in evangelization. And then if that's the point, then my question is, how would you do that? Or what are ways that you've seen have worked? Or do you suggest like, just be in your own room, write some poems like Coleridge, and then let it work?
Well, if you're as good as Coleridge, you can do that.
Well, I'll be in my room.
Yeah.
That won't work.
Time will tell. I think, no, absolutely right. In a way, I'm trying to be a few steps back to convince you that this is actually a good thing to do, but it will involve you in your context. So in Denmark, who are the people who are shaping the public conversation? What are people saying? And actually, are there points at which this converges with the way the Bible sees the world, or maybe contradicts it? Either way, that conversation is a very useful one because it's one that people might have recognized from what they see, you know, public sculptures or a TV program that everybody's watched or whatever. But what I'm trying to show, I suppose, is a step back from, you know, getting to the talk and saying, this is how this works. And so we can make the most of it because actually they're doing a lot of our work for us already. We just got to try and get into the wavelengths. the problem with the topic I was given is that I just felt there were so many things that needed unpacking before we could get to, because what I don't want is just to say, oh, well, here are a bunch of films that you can use as really good illustrations of X, Y, Z, which actually very often is to distort the thing that was made and what actually is being said. It's exactly the same as taking a verse from Scripture and saying, right, I'm going to preach on this verse, and you've not done the work understanding it in context. So there's a kind of exegesis we need to do of the cultures or the things that we're engaged with in the same way we need to do with the Bible. Does that make sense? Very, very quickly.
So with art, sometimes for example, in the garden that I live in Amsterdam, there are some art installations, and it's on the 7 works of how do you say barmhartigheid, like the Good Samaritan.
Okay.
There's a word for that. How is it? Yeah, something like that. Barmhartigheid.
The prodigal?
I don't know.
Never
mind. But there, and it is like representations of like the goodness of the Good Samaritan. But it's like, it's just some metal things in the garden. There's maybe a small board on it, and people just walk by it. Is that just
but
how
some
it is?
others don't.
Yeah,
You can't control. This is the thing. You cannot control what happens with it. In a way that's kind of parallel to God giving the world the Bible. People have done some terrible things with it. They've justified some appalling things. God is taking a huge risk in sending the Bible out. Crazy. Isn't there a better way? Yeah, quick one. If it's a whole new topic, then a whole new topic.
No, not huge. What my friend was trying to also communicate is something that I struggled with for a long time. How do you find the perfect recipe for whatever you do, whether that's art, whether that's science? How do you find the perfect recipe to communicate the message to people? And there is not a perfect one.
Right.
But something popped up in my mind while we're having this whole conversation. How do you think new advancing technologies are going to impact cultural engagement? AI, for example.
Yep.
I know it's a huge topic, but briefly, if you have any.
That is a whole thing.
Yes.
It's a very useful slave, a terrible master. That's all I have to say at this stage. But there are a whole bunch of other things. But, I use it. There are things that are very useful for. But for it to become a master, both in terms of kind of virtual relationships and determining what things mean and stuff, I think that's dangerous and scary. But there's a whole other, and I know that artists, particularly, and musicians and stuff, are very nervous because it just sort of, it's like, I've lost the word as well. That kind of dragnet fishing, isn't it? It just takes everything in its wake. Let me come back to this, just a few more things, because one of the things I would say in how you take this on, I would say start with your passion, start with what you love. Is there a band? Is there a film director? Is there a novelist or whatever it is, or a type of music, whatever? Do deep dives into the things that you already love and you will discover stuff. And the passions that you have for these things will work their way out, and you will see all kinds of connections, especially if you're, I don't know, what your role and focus is, but if you are doing evangelistic talks on campus and stuff, it'll bubble up if you approach it like this. What are these people saying? And sometimes they are revealing truth in unexpected ways. So what I want to just show is what you call vehicles of reality that are not quite what you might expect. And this is one of the reasons Christians are nervous, I think, because basically what you've got here is fiction telling the truth. Now, I've been trying to write a novel for the last 8 years, when I said to a friend in London that this is what I wanted to do, I've written a few non-fiction books. I think they're Christian books. In fact, you're going to get one in a minute, apparently, so that's nice. But he was wanting me to contribute a book to a series that he was editing, and I said, no, I'm actually trying to write a novel now. And he just looked at me like I was insane. Why would you want to do that? What a waste of time. Surely you should preach the gospel. I said, well, isn't it interesting? Jesus told quite a lot of fiction. In fact, the Bible has got rather a lot of fiction in it. Does that mean I don't believe it's true? No, quite the reverse. But I don't believe there was such a person as the Good Samaritan on the Jericho Road. He didn't exist. Jesus made it up. Big deal. Who cares? It's a story. It's telling the truth through fiction. But sometimes artists will play around with this because you think, hang on, what are you saying? So this is a very famous painting by Magritte. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. It is, but with a very serious intent. Right, it's a painting of a pipe. It is not a literal pipe. That would be a massive pipe, wouldn't it? That's not literally a pipe. It's an image of a pipe. And he's just forcing us to recognize that the image is not the same as the thing that is being represented. But there's a relationship. So in another way, and he's playing with us, he knows, of course, it's a pipe. And he knows that we're going to look at that and say, oh, but that's a pipe. But that's the point. And yet there's something prophetic about that, because so often in modern society, we confuse the image for the reality. We think that, the Star Wars movies happened. I think sometimes, and I know that there's a whole sort of area of thought, but people who do cosplay and go to these conventions dressed up as the, Spider-Man or Darth Vader or whatever, and there's a lot of fun in that, and I can see that there's a lot of community and so on. So, I don't want to be sort of all snobby and dismissive, but there is something a little disturbing if people cannot somehow clearly distinguish between what is fictional and what is real. And those boundaries are being blurred all the time with virtuality and all the rest. Magritte was saying something about this decades ago. And actually the title, this was 1929, so it's coming up for 100 years old, this painting. And he did a whole series of different ones. Ceci n'est pas une femme, this is not a woman, and so on. But it's called La trahison des images, the betrayal of images, or the treachery of images. They're treacherous. That's a fascinating thing. How true he is. I think there are a lot of times as a Christian, I want to say something about that kind of thing. He got there 100 years ago. Here's another one. This is more whimsical. It's a very odd painting by David Hockney. Okay, so basically what you've got two blokes and basically the sort of weird sort of outline of another one. These two are chatting. One's sort of dressed in a kind of sort of hippie 60s style. This other bloke has got nothing on, so that's a bit odd. And you're looking at that, what's going on there? And then there's this leopard coming out of nowhere, and it's literally, nanoseconds away from landing on the naked man. So there's all kinds of oddness there. Okay? It's meant to be odd. And then he's got these little words you remember those sort of things that you traced letters before printing, and stuff, you trace the letters on. Probably too young, yeah. Your grandparents did it. Anyway, no, parents probably. But he's got this little sentence, in between the leopard and the man, and this is what it says. They are perfectly safe. This is a still. Now, the word still is ambiguous. It can mean unmoving. It can also mean if you take, cinematic film and you cut out one frame, that is called a still. It's a still from the movie. So, you freeze frame. And so basically the action is frozen at a moment. And the title of this painting, he painted it in 1962, the title is called Picture Emphasizing Stillness. And he's playing with us because he's saying, it's okay, nothing is going to happen. A, because this is a painting and it doesn't move, so the leopard is always, till kingdom come, going to be there. And these are not actually talking, they're representations. It's not real. He's making a similar point to old Magritte. Now, we probably need to stop. I know, isn't that sad? Yeah, let's do questions. If you've had too many. But if no one else has a question, we'll come back to you. Do you have one? Okay.
Mark, how do you personally fit in or find ways in your regular week-to-week, day-to-day life to engage with art and poetry and film?
I'm a geek, and I am a total culture vulture. I kind of curl up and I kind of I grew up in a house where there was always music playing, classical music usually, not always though. Mum is an artist, and I started doing music from the age of 6. My brother went to art school. I've done music for years. I dabble at drawing and stuff, but nowhere, frustrating because I'm not like my brother or mum. And I ended up doing a literature degree, and so I just love literature. And it's kind of, I just can't get enough of it, and it's almost obsessive and unhealthy. But I think it took me about 20 years. I became a Christian when I was 18. It took me about 20 years, not quite the same dislocation that C.S. Lewis talked about, but I was converted into quite a narrow sort of understanding of discipleship. And I used to do some camps, and it was Christian camps for kids in the summer and stuff. And basically, the Christian life was, read your Bible, do evangelism, pray, and then go to heaven and get other people to go there as well. I was useful because I played the piano, so I had a use, but all the things that I loved from before I was converted, there just wasn't really a place for. And it took me a long time. It was going to things like L'Abri, if you know about L'Abri. So there are a number in Europe. English L'Abri is the one I went to, but there's Switzerland, there's Netherlands, and so on. Basically a community where I remember sitting in the tape library, they used to have cassettes, and seeing a tape called A Theology of Humor. I thought, what? Never heard of that. You can have a theology of humor? What's that? I listened to it. I was blown away. And they had talks on everything. And it was like, oh, I can think Christianly about those things. That was a revelation. And basically, as these things came together, I haven't looked back. And so I'm just constantly soaking it in. But, that's not everybody's cup of tea. If there's one thing you love, go for it.
Leave them for maybe over dinner.
Thank you, Mark. Do you also force yourself or make yourself watch or engage with the most popular films and music and bestsellers, books?
Sometimes. Do you want to add to that, Norman? You can, because he was asking. So my daughter, she's now 24, but she said, she came back from watching Barbie, said, "You've got to watch Barbie." And she actually came home from London to take us to the cinema to see it, to make sure we actually went to see it. And I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I didn't expect to. I was very positively surprised. I watched it again about 6 months later, and it didn't hold up, actually, interestingly. But as an experience in the cinema the first time, it was great. And I found it very provocative and interesting. So sometimes I will do that. A couple of friends and I, we've started a little podcast now called Triptych, and we try to discuss different, we call them sort of 3 masterpieces an episode that are all completely different, and seeing if they're connected. So we've just about to start recording the 2nd season. And that's trying to say, well, what is out there? What are people talking about? What helps us? What are they seeing that we've not seen? That kind of thing. Triptych, Triptych. It's on Spotify. Spotify is a pain, actually, but it's on Apple. It's on other podcasts things. A 3-part painting, exactly.
I think definitely grab Mark for the rest of this weekend. Make the most of his. What did you say? He had a D-min in this very subject. So there's loads more to it. Shall we show our appreciation for Mark?
Thank you very much. Everybody gets a free copy.
Yeah, and it looks like he's giving us a freebie, so grab a copy of that.
I haven't paid for this, Foyer has. So.
Great. Foyer are giving us a freebie, so grab one of those on your way out. And Mark, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's go get dinner.